Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming on a beautiful afternoon. I'm Catherine Dan. I'm the University Archivist here at ANU, and I'm delighted that you could come and attend our 2024 annual lecture. I'm particularly delighted that we have Professor Katerina Teaiwa to deliver this lecture. I would firstly, and most importantly, like to acknowledge that we are meeting here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and that we have the great privilege to live and work on these lands. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past and present, and to extend that acknowledgement to all First Nations people who are here with us in the room or online with a recording, and to express our gratitude to all First Nations people for continuing to be the holders of knowledge and culture, of understanding of land, sky and water. As I said, I'm very delighted to introduce Professor Katerina Teaiwa. We will have the lecture. There will be some time for questions, a vote of thanks, and then I hope you can join us for refreshments. Professor Teaiwa is someone who is familiar with archives, as a user of archives, also as someone who has made sure that material is preserved, but is also someone who knows the ambiguous nature of archives and collections. So I think we're in for a treat this evening. She's an interdisciplinary scholar, an artist, an award-winning teacher of Banaban, Kiribati and African American heritage, born and raised in Fiji. She's Professor of Pacific Studies in the School of Culture, History and Language here at the College of Asia Pacific at ANU, was founder and convener of the first Pacific Studies teaching program at ANU, and is currently Vice President of the Australian Association for Pacific Studies, also co-chair of the Oceania Working Party of the Australian Dictionary of Biography. We actually have some of the panels that relate to Dictionary of Biography Pacific Lives. You're welcome to have a look at those afterwards as well. She's editor of the Contemporary Pacific Journal and has led CHL's flagship project on decolonial possibilities, combining workshops, film production, education resources, and early career support, researcher support. I can see some early career support in the room, early career researchers. Her research-based exhibition, Project Banaba, which we will hear more of, focuses on the environmental, political and cultural impacts of historical phosphate mining, and it's been shown in Australia, New Zealand and the United States. Professor Teaiwa will reflect on her process of exploring archives and collections connected to Australia's long history of phosphate mining in the Pacific, in her lecture, Islands, Archives and Ancestors. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that beautiful, warm welcome. Thank you for opening the doors too, so that we could have some air and a beautiful breeze in here. Kamna Maori, Nisambula Vinaka, and Yuma, everyone. Oh, there's Bianca. Hello. I know it's the evening, it's a Thursday. The UC Caps are playing at the AIS, in case that's relevant to anyone. So I really appreciate you coming to this talk today and for the invitation to speak. Thank you so much. I also want to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, that this is their country. They did not cede sovereignty to the settler colony, and this continent and surrounding islands will always be Indigenous lands and waterways. I want to start by actually saying these are interesting, maybe a little exciting, but also kind of scary and devastating times, depending on your employment, your social, political, economic, and cultural persuasion. I want to acknowledge that many staff at the ANU right now are probably feeling quite precarious, especially after the recent announcements about restructuring and the projected dire financial state of the university. Staff in fields relevant to my talk today are rightly concerned, and if you're here, I really, really do appreciate your time and attendance in the midst of all of this challenging stuff. I also, especially as a US citizen, want to acknowledge the very concerning recent elections, which seem so far away, but I recently got an email from Dartmouth and I was like, people at Dartmouth are reading my work. It's all connected. So I want to acknowledge that I also want to advise you don't check your phone to see who all the different appointments are in the upcoming government, because it might give people a heart attack. But what I do want to do is acknowledge the ongoing colonization, extraction, militarism that exists across our region and several continents across the world, including in West Papua, Kanaki, Maui Nui, Guam, Hawaii, and of course in Palestine and Lebanon. The Pacific has been historically reliable on the diplomacy, solidarity, and environmental protection front, but things have changed quite rapidly. The geopolitics are intense, and we are now likely leading into a world primarily controlled by a very small, intense number of male billionaires. Okay, so I wanted to say that. Now, many of our leaders seem quite intent on learning very little from the past and from the vast records of colonialism, imperialism, conversion, extraction, exploitation, land grabbing, and the records of physical, spiritual, and epistemological violence towards so many cultures and communities, as well as the chronicles of many land, sea, and sky polluting industries and countless enterprises that have been doing their utmost over the last 500 plus years to ensure our planet is less habitable for most species. We live in times when the humanities, and particularly the field of history, is under threat and becoming devalued and defunded, right when these critical history lessons are most needed. Perhaps such lessons are inconvenient, uncomfortable, and not in line with the extraordinary accumulation of wealth by the top 1%, who have twice as much as the rest of the world combined. This is what capitalism and its accompanying imperial paradigms and projects have delivered humanity so effectively. When I started my Banaba research journey 28 years ago, I thought I was studying Banaban histories of loss and displacement, but it turned out to be a much more global story of empire, mass agriculture, industry, development, and ruin. So earlier this year, I spoke at a symposium at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, in a very beautiful building. And the symposium was called Visions, the Art, Science, and Politics of Seeing. The final speaker was an Australian scholar, Kate Crawford, who had worked on a project completed during her residency here at the ANU called Calculating Empires, a genealogy of technology and power since 1500. The project asked, how can we understand the operations of technology and power in our era? Our technological systems are increasingly complex, interconnected, automated, and opaque. Even places that were once off limits to capital, from our emotional expressions to outer space, are now subject to computational control and extraction. Meanwhile, the industrial transformations in AI, artificial intelligence, are concentrating power into fewer hands while accelerating polarization and alienation. If we are to address the urgent challenges of the contemporary time, including technocratic fascism, climate catastrophe, colonial wars, and wealth inequality, we need to contend with the interwoven nature of their histories. In order to have a future, we must first confront the past. So Calculating Empires explores, visualizes, and warns us about the power of knowledge, technology, data, and information systems based on the team's mapping of how these projects emerge from these histories of extraction, transformation, and decimation of material things such as lands, forests, oceans, waterways, minerals, and the bodies, the human labor and knowledges of slaves, indentured and lowly paid workers whose energy is required for the profits of a few. Social and political inequality is fundamental to this system. Climate change is a result of a 600-year anthropocentric process dominated mostly by cultures in the West and the East who have benefited from such technologies and so-called freedom, democracy, development, and innovation. Controlling the narrative is critical to this status quo, including the ways in which history is learned and understood. So calculating empire centers on 4 themes: communication, computation, classification, and control. 3 of these themes, communication, classification, and control, are central to the much less ambitious and yet still globally relevant Pacific Islands research that I have been engaged in for the last 3 decades or so. This is me not knowing how to use Canva and more sophisticated ways of presenting information, but I constantly feel like I have to map my work and all the different things I've done so I can remember what they are. So I have shared my research in many ways, from books to media essays to dance performances, and I have applied my training in interdisciplinary Pacific studies, which is a combination of history, anthropology, cultural studies, and the performing and visual arts, to countless research, teaching, service, policy, and organizational contexts and activities. I use both interdisciplinary and transdisciplinarity to describe these activities because I understand interdisciplinarity to be more of a theoretical, methodological, and analytical exercise, and transdisciplinarity to be one of applying, creating, influencing, problem solving, especially beyond the academy. I find myself repeating the same stories of extraction and resilience over and over again, just in different contexts, genres, and formats. In recent years, though, something has shifted in my thinking and in my understanding of why I persist with this work about Banaba, or what the British called Ocean Island. The young, energetic person I was at the ANU many, many years ago, who zoomed through 3 degrees in 10 years, who danced and cartwheeled through fieldwork and homework, who threw out her lower back and injured both wrists, who struggled to sit still at a desk to write papers, theses, and books, is now older, slower, mildly wiser, way more tired, and now with dozens of boxes of materials reflecting that research and the teaching and program building that emerged from it. I persist with this research topic because Banaba is still there, still with gaping holes, and now at the center of a political and economic tug of war between different Banaban factions and the ideas of Kiribati politicians backed by Chinese government interests. Now, I come from a family of civil servants, teachers, librarians, researchers, authors, and poets who do not like to throw things away. My grandmother, my mother, my sister, and my uncle kept thousands of books, papers, letters, and photographs in their own home for decades. My own numerous boxes of books, papers, photographs, CDs, DVDs, and mini DV tapes are very unpopular in my house and in the renovated Coombs building, where most scholars allowed 2 bookshelves and preferably no boxes in the basement. Matt knows what I'm talking about. Luckily, I've had some really kind school directors, one of which is here, who are very supportive of these boxes, which are hint, hint, need to go. But I will need to sort through and think about where all of these materials filled with stories about islands, archives, and ancestors, where they're going, how they will be stored and accessed by others. Hopefully future Banaban and Pacific Studies scholars who are interested in history, culture, land, art, and politics. I think I have an archive in the making, and I am not convinced always that digital versions, though digitization is important, but digital versions rely on power, rare materials, or rare minerals and other resources. And I'm not sure that this is the right format for saving it all for posterity. So I like things. I like material things. I like touching things, three-dimensional things, looking at things, stuff. Drives my husband crazy. My life growing up in Fiji, my training in interdisciplinary Pacific studies, shaped primarily by these teachers and scholars. Here's a hectic slide that I definitely didn't want to organize in list form, because then it would look like fake news, like not like I'm organized. This is more how it goes with me. So my training shaped primarily by a lot of these teachers and scholars and sources and collections. My exploration of many archives have deeply shaped my career in Pacific studies. I've tried to keep track because I have a bad memory and often can't remember where I've been and all the ways I've applied what I learned. But this list and the graphic before that helps remind me of the relationship between what I've been taught, the values, the knowledges, methods, pedagogies, and applications that have emerged from all the work. So I have to try to like keep them all together in my mind. So those are some of the major influences and sources of learning. And I'm always in a process of translating, reframing, and remixing data, really fragments of the past and of other people's ideas and words, in order to understand and address urgent challenges of the present, such as why it isn't so great to mine out our limited resources and displace Indigenous peoples to feed the insatiable needs for global development, growth, and profit. Technologies and industries that depend heavily on the extraction of fuel and minerals are not going to save our oceans and islands. And we do need to keep these lessons of islands, places, and peoples who have suffered under colonialism and globalization. We have to keep them in mind while still working towards justice, healing, and repair. So my research tracks and critically reflects on multi-sided and multi-scalar histories of Banaban lands, Banaban phosphates, Banaban peoples, and the ways in which they are deeply entangled with British colonialism in Oceania and the agricultural development and prosperity of Australia and New Zealand. The research itinerary overlaps with my own ancestry, kinships, education, and family histories in Fiji, Kiribati, the United States, Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, marked here by the yellow triangles. In the 1990s, at a time when Pacific research was still viewed as intensely specific or local, studying Banaba or Ocean Island, which is in the middle, required a much, much wider geographic and historical imagination. Over the years, I've worked with folks in CartoGIS and others, most recently the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, to try to visualize the flows of a 6-square-kilometer Pacific island across the seas to fuel global fertilizer, farming, and agricultural markets. This is my most recent mapping representing the flows of phosphate and labor, as well as the sites of global phosphate resources, which are in the dark gray, and the records, or at least the ones I've discovered so far, that are relevant to the Banaban story. When we started off making this map, they were like, oh, it looks like an airline map. So we had to keep working those arrows. Now, the massive history of phosphate mining in Western Sahara, for example, right, on the other side of the world, is completely entangled with the development of mining in the Pacific and the consumption of superphosphates, which continue today by both New Zealand and Australia. I'm regularly contacted by activists supporting the Indigenous peoples of the Western Sahara who describe their rock, their phosphate rock, as blood phosphate. The Banaban people and the story of their displacement from a phosphate island and their cultural transformation is very much grounded in 2 islands in Kiribati and Fiji, where most of my large family lives. Scholars such as Harry-Ann Honor-Maud, Martin Silverman, Wolfgang Kempf, and Elfriede Herrmann have produced insightful studies of how Banabans have adapted to their displacement and carved out new identities and cultural practices over time. But the story of the island goes much further. The land travels farther than the diaspora, and in many ways has a more complicated and at times deliberately concealed story. The gaping holes in the land and the limestone pinnacles that remain like bones constantly remind us that land, our ancestral lands, are missing and likely flowing through the soils, waterways, and digestive tracts of consumers beyond the Pacific. These stories of the land, rather than the people, are more visible in the archives than in the everyday lives of Banabans. This is what has emerged from what was once a one constellation, Teaiwa, linking land and people structurally and spiritually to the dispersed and fragmented reality of the present. Here, I'm not arguing necessarily that the past was better than the present, but rather that it matters and that there are major multi-scalar consequences when humans are delinked from their ancestral environments. When Aboriginal peoples signal their 60,000-year relationship to this continent, they are signaling a grounding and connection that means something in terms of how to live, how to value, and how to move through the world. So many years ago, in 1999, my 24-year-old self became quite fixated on a series of letters and numbers in the National Archives of Australia, CA244, and a huge number of series, including MP1174, who mysteriously now I cannot find on the National Archives website. I don't know what's happened to MP1174, but I need to go find that. And R32, which is still there. There are 181 listed series under CA244, and each of these contains dozens of boxes and items. I once added up the file sizes of each item manually, and it came close to 500 meters of materials about Banaba in the National Archives alone. That's just the National Archives. CA244, an intergovernmental agency, was controlled by organization CO72, which existed between 1920 and 1987, but included records of earlier companies going back to the 1890s. The function and purpose, phosphate mining and fertiliser manufacture, both a matter of national and agricultural security. That same year, I emailed the contact listed on the beautiful pages of the Fertiliser Industry Federation of Australia website, inquiring about this intergovernmental agency that was featured so prominently on their website as their founder. Their pages had a long, detailed, celebratory history of the phosphate prospectors and champions of Australian farming that had gathered all stakeholders to represent and strengthen their stakes in fertiliser import, manufacturing, supply, and distribution. Most of this power was concentrated in Phosphate House that once graced Collins Street in Melbourne. I received a brief acknowledgement to my email, but not the access to the FIFA records that I'd hoped for. A few months later, this Fertiliser Industry Federation of Australia website erased all information associated with its founding agency. It was wiped clean. There were paragraphs and paragraphs about it, and after my email, they wiped it clean. The entire history and reference to their founders disappeared. Now, I was an international student on a PhD scholarship at the ANU with limited scholarship time and resources, determined to finish within 3.5 years. So while I found this deletion of critical information about the founders of the Fertiliser Industry Federation, I found it extraordinary and obviously super suspicious. I could not pursue the incident. Clearly, their lawyers had advised the comms department to remove all reference to their industrial ancestors. I had identified myself in the email as a Banaban PhD student, and the Banabans had sued the founding agency, the British Phosphate Commissioners, co-owned by the Australian, New Zealand, and British governments just 2 decades earlier. Banabans had failed in their lawsuit, but the BPC had swiftly wrapped up mining at the end of the trial and walked away from the immense phosphate infrastructure and housing that had been built up since 1900, partially destroyed in World War II, and rebuilt and developed since 1946 after removing the Banabans to Fiji in 1945. The BPC had controlled a critical supply of phosphate rock from Nauru, Banaba or Ocean Island, and Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. They eventually sold their mining interests to the independent government of Nauru in 1967, handed Banaba to the newly formed government of Kiribati in 1979, and relinquished management of mining of the Australian territory of Christmas Island in 1981. The BPC's legacy was clearly positive on the Australian and New Zealand fronts, somewhat embarrassing on the British front, where the trial waged for years, and culturally, socially, and environmentally devastating, though temporarily economically lucrative for Nauruans and Banabans. Many stories are told about Nauru's boom and bust, and a few less sensational ones about the Banabans, but almost none of them go into any specific detail about what happened to Nauruan and Banaban lands once they were dug up. Where did they go? For a cultural region so heavily shaped by the relationship between people and their lands, I found it really odd that rocks somehow ceased to be land in an indigenous sense once they were dug up. So it's indigenous if it's in the ground, but it's not indigenous if it's out of the ground. The literature indicated that a handful of colonial officers and journalists had recorded snippets of Banaban culture and oral traditions, and an even smaller number of anthropologists had done more deeper studies of Banaban cultural symbolism and transformation. Small number of historians had celebrated the pioneering efforts of the phosphateers, who'd built a powerful Antipodean industry. What was missing, however, was the material basis of the whole enterprise: the trees, the lands, the waterways that were forever changed by the industry. As phosphate was flowing from the Pacific to Australia and New Zealand, fresh water from Australia was being shipped to Banaba for the employees at the mine. 8 decades of land going one way and 8 decades of fresh water going the other way. I came across this line by virtual artist Dave Sagg, playing on a quote by Gertrude Stein that seemed to capture the situation most poignantly. There was a lot of there, here, and a lot of here, there, and very few scholars making those material connections. Teaiwa, the land, had become a symbol holding Banaban identities together without that structural or material foundation. The land in Fiji belonged to Fijians, and at times Banabans tried to figure out how to make sense of the relations between Fijian and Banaban ancestral spirits. My own thinking became fixated on the material: the rocks, the steel, the cables, the train tracks, the hoppers and skips, the buoys and lengths of chain, the storage bins, the cantilevers, and the hundreds of ships that moved back and forth between Banaba and dozens of ports. The story of this industry was in the ruins on Banaba, which I thoroughly explored twice by foot and by jeep, and in the archives. Archives, libraries, and material collections are spaces that I actually find exciting, devastating, and obviously cold, but it's not cold in this library today. My master's thesis supervisor, history teacher, and former boss at the Center for Pacific Island Studies in Honolulu, Professor David Hanlon, wrote about the chill of history, the experience, emotion, and changing politics of archival research in the Pacific. He described it as a chill that possesses physical, intellectual, and political dimensions, and that bears directly on the administration and use of libraries and archival collections. Hanlon wrote of actually freezing in Pacific collections in Honolulu while reflecting on the colonial source of the frigid air conditioning. But he also wrote of the warm emotional connections made through uncovering human stories in such cold archives. He talked about the similar chill felt by his fellow historian, who was one of my mentors, Greg Denning. Greg Denning similarly experienced very human, very embodied aspects of the past in archival spaces. He acknowledged that both he and Denning were outlanders, what he called outlanders, but that the experience of other historians, such as Pacific Islanders, finding their ancestors in these cold spaces might be a little different. Hanlon wrote, "There is a joy tinged with sadness, perhaps, that comes from finding an ancestor's name mentioned in a letter, report, or diary. A joy tinged with sadness from viewing photographs of earlier generations of family. A joy tinged with sadness from examining old maps on which are drawn the landscapes of places now changed or gone." In the National Archives of Australia, where I started my archival journey in 1999 with agency series CA244R32, has 9,249 visual items documenting decades of life and industry on Ocean Island, or Banaba. You have to use both those terms, Ocean Island and Banaba, plus phosphate, to find anything. I viewed over half of these 9,429 photographs and items, which took many days, and rephotographed almost 400 of them with the help of a family friend who lived in Melbourne. These, more than any other aspect of the archives, which was a lot of paper, that half a kilometer of paper, underscored the very material nature of the mining enterprise and the temporary civilization and industrial development. The company must have kept excellent photographers on staff, and they took pictures of absolutely everything. And when I say everything, it's like, I don't know, you'd have like an anchor and they took like 50 angles, photos of the anchor. Photos of actual Banaban people, however, were very limited. And this spoke volumes about how the company began to view our ancestors as a problem. So these are some of the, they're beautiful photographs from these archives of laborers, of the employees, of laborers who came from Hong Kong and from Japan. And these are the early days of the mining enterprise. And this is a photograph of our the senior village on Banaba, who would have been part of the group that had to sign off on the mining leases and had no idea what they were signing. And they also don't look so happy. So this is me in the Burwood office of the National Archives, so not the Canberra office, the one in Melbourne. The big storage facility, looking at a large map that took up most of the floor of a very large space. So it was like this big, the map. There was probably Sarah McLachlan playing in the background because the archivists like Sarah McLachlan. But the map showed land holdings at a critical point in Banaban history after World War II. Right after they'd been displaced, Banabans had been displaced to Fiji, and after they'd become desperate for stability and peace. After they'd been convinced to remain on Rambi in northern Fiji, imagining that they might have easy access to visit their ancestral home whenever they needed. This trip, where they sent Banabans back from Rambi to Banaba to map the land holdings, was called the land dividing trip, where Banabans may or may not have recorded their holdings so accurately, and where the fluid transfer of land from parents to children of all genders and to adopted children became changed forever in service of a more patriarchal view of land rights. Now, Ewan Maidment, who's here today, just so lovely, and Monica Wiener from the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau wrote a very useful essay that I've assigned to my students in Pacific Studies here every single year. In it, Maidment and Wiener argue that the archive is haunted by ancestral voices, and that access to ancestral voices and knowledge remains crucial in many contemporary Pacific Island societies. It forms the basis for land entitlement. While recording such entitlements problematically fixes a once fluid land tenure system, the evidence of relations to land in the archives provide opportunities to apply Indigenous discourses and frameworks in order to excavate, reconstruct, and repatriate, or even better, rematriate knowledge of land to the people. It then requires critical, equitable, inclusive values and ethics in order to ensure such knowledge of land is not exploited by a few. This is an image of a notebook I found in the Pacific collection of the Bar Smith Library in 1999 at the University of Adelaide, where Harry Maud, former resident commissioner of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, ANU historian, founder of the Pacific Manuscripts Bureau, and co-founder of the Journal of Pacific History, donated his vast collection of Pacific books, records, and papers. I don't know many Pacific Studies scholars in Adelaide. Maybe you do, so that's good. But his collection is there, and I try to direct all students to travel there, go explore it, but not many do. Now, recalling David Hanlon's words about emotion and the archives, and one of his most profound lectures where he brought a large rock from Pohnpei into the classroom and asked students to listen to the rock, I was definitely trying to hear Banaban rocks in the archives. There were all kinds of emotions felt as I explored that collection, including one not mentioned by Hanlon, that of anger. This particular emotion is not a favorite of some scholars who believe it compromises objectivity and rigor. Stuff that. Nakia Ware, who is recorded on this page in Morn's spindly pencil writing, was my great-great-grandmother. And the word finished means her lands have been mined out. Now, I've written about this experience elsewhere, and over the years have formed a defiant and still appreciative relationship with Harry and Anna Maud's collections and their legacy. Maud, though, was rude to my elder sister and changed her scholarly trajectory. He was still alive when I commenced my PhD at ANU, but I decided not to talk to him because I was worried about how he was a gatekeeper of knowledge and records about Banaba and the Gilbert Islands. He was the agent of Banaban and Gilbertese displacement. And while he was understood to have respectful and friendly relations with islanders, he preferred to share his work primarily with men, with grateful Banabans he deemed authentic, and with Australians he thought might save the Banabans from the cultural, environmental, spiritual, and genealogical dislocations that he himself had engineered in service of the British Empire. Now, the ways in which existing literature and archival records made me feel about Banaban histories, the way they'd been built and held by the BPC, various government departments, and influential figures like Maud, inspired possibly the only book I'll ever write, Consuming Ocean Island, where I utilized all that archival, visual, and textual content to critically reflect on how Banabans and Banaban lands would forever exist between islands and continents. 2 years later, though, after I published this book, with the guidance of Samoan Japanese artist Yuki Kihara, I decided to convert the research into a multimedia exhibition that would follow the routes taken by Banaban phosphate, BPC employees, and mining laborers, many of whom were Gilbertese, Tuvaluan, Chinese, and Japanese. I wanted to be able to present words and images from the archives in ways that were not overdetermined by the expectations and demands of an academic history. One reviewer of my book was frustrated with the lack of an authoritative voice and a more chronological presentation of what happened. I consistently, though, wanted to tell the fragments. I wanted to tell the stories of fragments, fragments of letters, fragments of rocks, fragments of records, fragments of images, and I wanted them all to speak for themselves. This is one quote that I use constantly in my work. It's the words of the very famed and very celebrated other British colonial administrator turned historian and radio star, Sir Arthur Grimble, who threatened the Banabans if they did not lease more land to the company. In 1928, when the Banabans were feeling at a very low point, he pointed them to sign the agreement and he said, I will present to you two things, points for life or points for death. What would you like? If you sign the agreement, your offense in shaming the important chief, referring to the monarch, will be forgiven and you will not be punished. If you do not sign the agreement, do you think your lands will not go? Do not be blind. Your lands will be compulsorily acquired for the empire. That was definitely a low point for the Banabans, to which I think seeded the foundations of Banaban activism. If engagement with the archives was for my PhD, and the creation of the book for the academic career, because we're expected to write books, but also for the Banaban people, my exhibition, which I produced in 2017 at Carriage Works in Sydney, I have made primarily for the island, for Banaba, and for the ancestors, and for a small effort towards healing, repair, and what I increasingly understand to be a necessary rematriation of the island. Rematriation is a process often led by women or by values centered on people, on care of place and care of people, rather than formal relations across institutions and states. As the exhibition traveled from Sydney to the east coast of the North Island, to Napier, to Auckland, and to Honolulu between 2017 and earlier this year, several members of the local communities would emerge to add their stories to the exhibition. There was the doctor in Hawke's Bay at the gallery just down the road from the largest phosphate processing plant in New Zealand, who brought several beautifully photocopied files of his father's story. Oh, yay, ANU! This always happens to me in my classes. You guys know that. So I met this doctor in Napier who brought several beautifully photocopied files of his father's story, serving in the Navy and leading the Allies to Banaba, where he received the surrender from the occupying Japanese forces. Talking to him was incredible. There was Professor Alice Tupunga Somerville and his students who came all the way to the exhibition, drove across from Waikato, who came to sit under the textiles and other things that I had in the exhibition and discuss phosphate flows between Banaba and Aotearoa. One of her students, the mother of the current Miss Samoa, scholar Wanda Jeremiah Allen, kindly translated the diary of a Samoan pastor on Banaba who lived with them in the Japanese war camps. So the exhibition kind of creates more stories and then more content and more collections, more memoirs and other things flow into the boxes that are in the bottom of Coombs building at the moment. So the exhibition kind of generates an archive of its own. And we have this thing called Air Table or some kind of fancy table. And there's like There's hundreds of objects in that thing. This is an image from Auckland where Project Banaba was shown alongside a community exhibition called Te Kanias, where our team supported Banaban communities to obtain a grant from Creative New Zealand and conduct workshops on cultural revitalization for youth and others. Now, I am almost finished and I'm keeping my eye on the time. But I just want to explain a little bit about the exhibition, which is divided into 3 parts. Body of the land and body of the people are the textiles that you see. They feature content from the archives, photographs and things like that. They also have the pivot logo. And if you're from Victoria, if you grew up in Victoria, you know about Pivot. It's all across the farming landscape. And they were the company that would distribute the phosphate to farmers. On the other side of the textiles, I have pinnacles, which represent the bones of the island left behind. So that is body of the land, body of the people. There is then also the 3-screen projection, which is based on my research from the ANU, archival film footage from the early 1930s on Banaba, which was in the National Archives. And it's cut together so that you experience 100 years of mining history on Banaba. And it's called Mine Lands for Teresia, in honor of my late elder sister. The third section of it, which you can sort of see up there, is called Teaiwa's Kainga. It's a photographic reef displaying our family homestead, our kainga, outside the village of Tabyang, where my father's brothers and sisters and now my cousins have built their homes. It is interspersed with other archival images of phosphate processing. Now, this is a more recent visit I made to Melbourne last year, where I had a residency at the University of Melbourne. And here I explored some images from a similar era, but from the State Library of Victoria. And this time when I went, there was a film crew, and it was very a different experience from the lovely calm and quiet and serene process of going through archives when you've got a film crew pointed at you. So very interesting experience because I had to like interpret how I saw and read the archives to that team. I also conducted a workshop with the students of Dr. Alex Martinez-Rowe, who was hosting me at the Victorian College of the Arts Drawing Program, where we reflected on images from the BPC collection and reframed and represented them according to the students' interests. Almost all of them attempted to decolonize the content, challenge the company, or represent them in a way that returns some form of justice to the island and to Banabans. Now, you've now seen images of me in archives from 1999 to 2024, and that's how long I've been staring at, analyzing, and reflecting on these archival images and seeing something new or different each time. 25 years with the same archival content that yields countless views into Banaban pasts. I do want to bring Project Banaba to Melbourne one day. Okay, so I'm going to try to wrap up so that we can actually have time for discussion, but there is a lot of stuff going on now on Rambi and on Banaba and politically, socially, and economically between Fiji and Kiribati. At one point, Banaba ran out of drinking water, and there was a flurry of stories about that. Another time, they had a big food crisis, and there was a story about that. And then a bunch of miners from South Australia, based in Queensland, wanted to remine the island, and that really brought out all the activists on Banaba, which has caused a few political challenges for young people there. So I've become quite involved in that, and I talk to Banabans on Rambi and on Banaba quite regularly. They've created the Banaban Human Rights Defenders Network. A lot of content from the archives is like gold to them. So I'm always like sending them links to stuff that's been digitized. When they see a map of the island with the land holdings, they're like, how do we get a copy of that map? The archival content is so relevant and critical now in 2024. It's really, really critical and relevant. So whenever Ray Baintes, who's one of our amazing young Banaban leaders. Whenever he comes to Canberra, because he does a lot of human rights work, I send him straight to the Pacific Research Archives, bring out all the files and folders about Banaba and labor and so many things, and he goes through them. So this stuff is still extremely relevant today. Okay. So this is more of the Banaban Human Rights Defenders Network. And what I love about what they're doing, so this is, Rambi today, is it resonates so much with the activism of Banabans in the past. This is Banabans in 1979 protesting on Banaba, and soon after they actually blew up the mines. There was skirmishes with the Gilbertese police. It was a very intense period. My grandparents were on Banaba at this time as part of the protests. And you can see kind of the past and the present linking and in dialogue with still an ongoing sense of urgency to safeguard the island. So this is the most recent image that I've added to Project Banaba, which was most recently shown at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, which was really, truly an incredible experience. And they presented my research in an extraordinary, dense and colorful and interesting way in the JM Long Gallery. And it was an experience that made me consider different kinds of audiences for this archival and artistic work, including children and families and people who had no idea about the Pacific. So if you're interested, you can see a video on YouTube that is a walkthrough the exhibition. So I won't go into that too much today. The other thing that has come out of Project Banaba is I've been inspired to work more with folks who have connections to Banaba and also have scientific and other kinds of knowledge about how we can potentially restore and rehabilitate the island. Now, this might not be something that the Kiribati government or the Granby Council is particularly interested in, but if you want an alternative for the island, you have to have some kind of model or proposal or a plan. So we're currently trying to figure out how we can ecologically repair the island. And rather than pour some soil into the holes, how can we actually regrow the island? And this finally is my upcoming project, which is where Project Banaba now comes from Honolulu back to Sydney, and it will be opening in 2025. So Project Banaba is heading to the Chowchak Wing Museum in 2025 at the University of Sydney, where it will change quite a bit in terms of dialogue with the collections and works, the archives of Australian ballerina Beth Dean, whose extensive and somewhat problematic studies and performances of Indigenous costumes and choreographies very much shaped Banaban cultural revitalization and performance in the 1970s. And this was particularly around the Festival of Pacific Arts, which had emerged as a major forum for safeguarding and presenting traditional Pacific culture. So I've decided to center the next iteration of Project Banaba on dance and dance movement and the role of Banaban women. Which is something that is quite hidden in the archives, and you have to like hunt for women and things associated with women in the archives. So I want to signal that role of women, but also consider and reflect on how it's changed for the Banaban diaspora. So this is my daughter, who is a young Banaban woman. She was born and raised in Australia, and we took her to the Chowchak Wing Museum and to their collections of Banaban costumes and other items, and had her as a young Banaban person kind of critically reflect on what that meant for her. So she's an athlete and a dancer and moves in a way that is quite different from the kinds of cultural Banaban dances we learned in Fiji. So I want to challenge this idea of what women or Banaban women are supposed to do and how they're supposed to be, but also this idea that Banaba is now here in Australia as part of the diaspora. So now I just want to end with the words of a dear friend, Aboriginal scholar and poet Natalie Harkin, who I greatly respect and who I now work very closely with on an ARC Indigenous project about reshaping the humanities through Indigenous creative arts. In her essay on archival poetics and her method of weaving, so that's her method of working in the archives, Natalie wrote, "Weaving became a central conceptual metaphor and a literal cultural practice in my research and archival poetic praxis to liberate these letters," and she's talking about letters from her ancestors, "in ways previously unimagined, to free them from the state and weave them back into the world, into my family and into my body, and to transform forwards through an archive fever labor of love." It became an intuitive means to gather, hold, and liberate her Nana, and her great-grandmother's words from the archive box, to reckon with history and honor a very different story to what was officially documented on the record about them. Now, I am not as eloquent as Natalie, who is a beautiful poet, but through the creative arts, I have tried to do the same, to liberate Banaban voices, stories, and rocks from the archive box. Thank you. And this is me in the Maud collection, again in the Bath Smith Adelaide Library. And I love just walking up and down those stacks. And I'm finding my books in Harry Maud's collection, my sister's books in Harry Maud's collection.
Thank you. And we will call for questions. Thank you so much. So many wonderful words, boxes, stuff, fragments, liberating. Yeah. Over to you. Questions?
In my dreams, yes. Well, isn't it ironic that the one high island in Kiribati is ruined by empire and industry and Australia and New Zealand and Great Britain? Like for me, this is like the crazy thing about climate change, because Kiribati is at the forefront of fighting for climate action and climate policy, and no one's talking about the one high island that everybody ruined and benefited from, including the Gilbertese government. And this is an unpopular kind of point of tension between Banabans and Ikiribas, of which we are both. Like I am Ikiribas and I am Banaban, so it's like a family fight over the ways in which Banaba was kind of sacrificed for development, sacrificed to grow the colony. The colonies survived on the taxes. The Gilbert and Ellice Islands survived on the taxes from the mining. And then they all walked away from it. They'd polluted all the fresh water. They'd ruined the landscape. Their 22 million tons had been extracted, and it was filled with asbestos and lots of rust and decayed infrastructure. And now they need some high islands. And they're trying to like build up 2-meter above sea level coral atolls when you had an 80 meters above sea level island. Now it is a small island and probably max like 2,500 people, unless you went full Singapore or full Hong Kong on it and built some really high rises. But I mean, the point is, how do we learn these lessons of history and the narratives we've been told about development and civilization and industry? Like they had movie theaters, they had a golf course, they had a swimming pool, they had lots of cool stuff. And now it's like, it's an industrial wasteland. That's what I want people who bang on about development in the Pacific to actually think about. What is the material basis of your development? What bodies, what lands, what rocks, what trees, what waterways? Be specific. Be specific. And there's a lot of, when I bring this stuff up, they're like, oh, but people should have the right to develop and all that. I'm like, well, and so does the earth have a right not to be polluted. But yeah, you touched on a really like point for me where I'm like, that's the high island.
Thank you, Patty, I always learn something new too about Banaba. I'm really interested, I was struck by a comment you made about your decision whether or not to talk to Maud while he was still alive. And, you know, when you're engaging with someone's archives and collections, and if they're alive, that's always an opportunity, but then it's also a decision because what people collect is also very much to their interests as well. So how did you navigate, I guess, working out, you know, all the different archives that are there, understanding that people only keep perhaps the things that are important to them, and then whether or not to talk to those who are still alive?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the reasons why I like the archive. I like Maud's archive. He kind of kept everything. He kept a lot of stuff. And I tell people, if you want to understand the Pacific from the middle, go to that archive. If you want to understand it from the perspective of Papua New Guinea, which is massive, or Polynesia, which dominates the literature, or Australia and New Zealand, then you go somewhere else. But if you want to understand the region from the middle of the region, you go to Maud's archive, because his way of thinking, even though he published all of this stuff about other parts of the Pacific, it actually starts in the middle and radiates out. You can see his items, his papers, his frame of the Pacific emerging from the tiny islands in the middle and then out to the rest of the Pacific. And that's a pretty different way of thinking about this region. It's a different way of thinking about Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, and it's a different sense of Oceania that I don't think you find if you're in Fiji, or you're in Vanuatu, or Papua New Guinea, or Solomon Islands, or in Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, Tahiti, you know, somewhere else. So it is very unique because his brain and my brain actually like thinking about the Pacific in that way. Now, he was in the Central Pacific because he was the resident commissioner. So different reasons. But he'd written, and it's in my book, he wrote a really nasty letter to my elder sister where he talked about her race, our races. Like he talked about us being of mixed heritage and he called us miscegenated. And so I was like, you know, I don't know if it would be very nice to like sit and have a cup of tea with Maud, even though I like his archives, I like his collection, because I love the past. I love things of the past, but I'm not very good at being straight-faced, and I would be terrible at poker or whatever other kinds of games where you have to like have a good game face. I would be, yeah, angry. So that wouldn't be nice to an elderly person. So for his sake, I decided not to visit him. But I know others who did. I know he gave stuff to these people. And I know there's some private collections about Banaba in Queensland and the Gold Coast, which also have been fed by collections from the ANU. They are in the wrong hands. We'll edit it out of the video. They're in not good hands at all. So it is problematic where these things go, who possesses them, and how accessible they are. And so what I do appreciate about Maud is that it is actually accessible. It is funded, as far as I can tell, that is in perpetuity, that collection, and they add to it. It's one of the few places where it's only the Pacific. You don't have to wade through all the other books and whatever. It's just the Pacific in those stacks, radiating out from the center and with other content from other parts. So it's very, very unique. So love the archive, different relationship with the person. Yeah, because he was also responsible for the displacement of Gilbertese to the Solomon Islands as well. And that's another aspect of his work to be explored. So yeah, in the Pacific, you have to be respectful of your elders, and I wasn't going to be able to do that. I also tried to write about it and publish it in the Journal of Pacific History, and the editors kind of looked at it and were like, don't publish this one. Yeah.
I don't want to keep going on about her anymore, but when did he write that letter?
1995 or 1996. So he would have been, it was a very coherent, very
No, I was,
clear letter. Like, so I'm not sure how old he was. He passed away 2001 or 2000.
I never met him,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
knew his son quite well.
Yeah.
My impression was that he was the commissioner, and he did feel bad about being the commissioner. And that's why he set up all these archives and all these libraries, and why he's put money into it.
Yeah, and you
Because
can
he was
feel that in the collection.
guilty,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure if you could feel angry about someone who's still guilty for those projects.
Well, that's why I didn't want to look at him face to face and, also I think he refused to testify in the trial in England, which would have been super helpful for the Banabans. And so he would have been going through a lot of guilt about a lot of things. But in the letter, he said to my sister, the Banabans are really happy they were moved. I went to Rambi and they thanked me. And I was like, nah, that's all right. Yeah, so he was kind of like trying to tell himself stories about it's okay. But then if you go into his archives, you're like, this is not okay. But I love that collection. I
I'm not
love
sure
it so much.
It's okay, but yeah, who knows?
Yeah, exactly. Now I wish I had gone and talked to him, but 24-year-old me was so stroppy, man. Like that's not, like now I could do it. Now I could do it.
I was just going to say one last question, and we might wrap up and we can continue discussion. It's about building the archive, because you mentioned that you have an archiving process. I was just interested in your comments about being an archivist of your own archive. What are the things that are important to you in doing that? Because many archives are colonial collections. How do you feel, and what do you do in building that material that will go on in some form, in some sort of archives?
I feel like that's the question of the next 10 years
Okay.
of my career. And I think I've said it to Matt, and I've said it to a few others, especially when CHL admin says, Katerina, you have 20 boxes still in the basement. So it does take me a very long time to figure out what to do. Like, I don't do fast research. I do really slow research, and I think for a long time before I like do something. So like having an exhibition in 2017 is after thinking about an exhibition in 1999. So I think with the archive and with trying to figure out how to organize and signpost the content, that is actually something. Every time I visit one of these archives or I go to a collection in the state library or somewhere, I'm like, oh my God, we need guides and we need framing and we need signposting and we need a little bit of interpretation, not too much interpretation, but we need something to show people why certain content is important and relevant to them. Because the important thing about the Banaban research for me is that it somehow is magically and mysteriously relevant globally. And I get contacted by people all over the world who read my book or came across Project Banaba and say, this resonated with me. So it's a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, but it's a story of imperial destruction and ruin by technology and industry and pollution of waterways and removal of trees and things like that. And so lessons from that are really, really resonating. And I've done many projects with different groups around the world. So I feel like one of the ways we can liberate the archives is to help tell that story about the wider meaning and relevance. It's not just for people related to the people in the thing. And, if you're Fijian, then it's relevant to you, or if you're Banaban, it's relevant to you. No, that's a pedagogical thing to be able to explain how particular histories of mining are so relevant to people who maybe had nothing to do with mining, because we're all consumers. We're all consumers. So you've eaten a product that has come from mining, essentially. So it's that kind of work. That's what archives need. And they also need to be really diverse, right? So it's not all letters and papers. And that's why the visual is so important to me.
Well, Bruce, who is the chair of the Friends of the Noel Archive Centre. So this lecture is co-organised by the Friends and the Archives. So Bruce is our chair to give a vote of thanks.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Can I too begin by affirming the acknowledgement of country? This always was, it always will be Aboriginal land. As we come to a close this evening, it's my immense privilege to move a vote of thanks on behalf of the Friends, on behalf of the audience here in the Menzies Library, and what a wonderful engaged audience you've been. And of course, on behalf of those future listeners who will listen to this recording. And I feel sorry for them because I don't think a recording can possibly capture the excitement of you live on the stage. I'm sure you'll all appreciate what a great deal of work went into this evening. We must thank Catherine Dan, our university archivist, and the able MC this evening. We thank all of the archive staff who work so diligently to support researchers, people like myself, and to care for the invaluable records that they hold here. We acknowledge the immense contribution of the Scholarly Information Service communication team, whose professional expertise made tonight a success. And we thank our university librarian, Roxanne Missing, who joins us tonight, for her steadfast support of the archives in these really challenging times. And that brings me to our speaker. Thank you, Katerina, for that challenging and inspiring address. Now, I know in your teaching, you sometimes use the metaphor of a canoe to describe the process of teaching and learning. You invite your students to climb aboard, to grasp that paddle firmly in their hands, and to row together with common purpose to a shared destination. And what an extraordinary journey you have taken us on this evening. Thank you. We've circled the oceanic islands of Banaba, your ancestral home, places that are steeped in stories. We've witnessed the trauma of their transformation to a gutted and industrialised landscape, of places, you put it, of rust and decay. You conveyed tonight the ruin of a landscape by the immensely destructive processes of phosphate mining and the forced relocation of the island's people. But, and this is so important, you also signalled agency, generations of resistance to exploitative colonialism, and in that surely the hope of both environmental and cultural renewal, what you called in that eloquent phrase, justice, healing, repair. You have liberated those voices from archives which so often suppress them. Your lecture tonight, Katerina, reminded me of Anne Stoll's discussion of imperial formations, the political life of what she calls imperial debris, a great phrase. And building on the work of other critical theorists and, of course, the exhibition that you put together, you've helped us to reimagine the Pacific, not just as a sea of islands, but also a sea of phosphate, in which both rocks and people flow across cultural and political borders. And that phrase, that haunting phrase, blood phosphate, just sticks now in my mind. Just as we've traversed an immense physical distance tonight, you have also charted an equally challenging course through the archives, all 500 metres of those holdings and more. Your multi-sited, multi-scalar and multi-vocal approach examined not just the textual sources, which we as historians are so familiar with, but also visual and material forms, choreographic forms. You truly challenged, I think, colonial narratives. And in that you expanded and you subverted our understanding of the archives, how the archives, as you put it, are seen and how they are read. And I'm sure everyone here tonight was simply bedazzled by the way that Katerina mapped her research. It's not simply a scholarly article, it's dance, it's theatre, it's a podcast, it's a presentation. It goes everywhere and it's enabling in so many ways. Thank you for all of that, and thank you most of all for reminding us again of the power and political relevance of our discipline. It may well be that conservatives seek to erase the historical record, but what you've shown us tonight is how much more difficult it is to silence the voice of a good historian. Thank you. Tonight, everyone, was the 22nd annual history lecture fielded by the Noel Butlin Archives. That's an archive in itself. We think these lectures demonstrate the importance of these archives in the life of our university. And it's a university, I remind us, that is obliged by its founding charter to engage with the Pacific that surrounds us. And on the 22nd lecture, as with every lecture before it and every lecture that will follow, we will signal our appreciation with both acclamation and a gift. And the gift, not surprisingly, is a book. Well, it will transform into a book.
Go in those boxes.
That's right. And the book Katerina has chosen is very much in keeping with her address tonight. It's Wendy Matuma's study of the legacies of colonialism, Waiting for the Cool Moon. Can you please join me in thanking Katerina as we present her with this gift voucher from the Friends of the Noel Butlin.
Thank you.
And now we have a chance to enjoy some refreshments. Can I thank Anne Piggott and the Friends for providing these for us tonight? And can I invite you all to join in that conversation with Katerina? Thank you.
Thank you.